Right, welcome everybody. My name is Kathy Brown and I'm the Director of Governance at the Mead Educational Trust based in Leicester. And Alison has asked me to come and do a bespoke session on suspension and exclusions, and particularly around the panels that you have to have for, in some cases, around suspensions and exclusions. I've had lots of experience sitting on panels and also clerking them. So I'll be drawing on some of those experiences as we go through. And as I said, feel free to ask questions as we go through. I'll bring up the PowerPoint in a minute, but I just wanted to do the introduction face to face first of all. So my aim today is, first of all, to develop your understanding of suspensions and exclusions and what happens when those happen and who takes the decision. I'll also then, well, the meat of this session really is about governors' discipline committees and how they review suspensions and exclusions, what triggers them when they have to meet, what guidance and policies apply to how they should be conducted, and then how they actually work in practice and what sort of questions you might ask and what you should be considering, what decisions you can take. And then finally, what happens if there is an appeal against the decision of the governor's discipline panel, committee, rather. I should get your terminology right. There's a lot of information in this presentation. I'm not expecting you to remember it all because some of it gets a bit technical, but what I'm aiming to do is to raise your awareness of what you need to be aware of. There is DfE guidance that covers all of this, but probably a more user-friendly version is your own trust's suspension and exclusions policy, which I'll refer to as we go through. So I'll me get on with the presentation. Can you all see that? Okay. I just need Alison or Jenny to give me a thumbs up.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Kathy. Yeah.
Right. So I'm just going to cover on in a few slides now what actually happens and what a suspension and an exclusion is. And it's covered by this DfE guidance, and you've got the link there as well. And it's a pretty large document, and it covers the legal responsibilities of who suspends or permanently excludes pupils, and also the governing body's duty to consider suspensions and exclusions, and quite a few other sections as well. And I'm covering this bit at the beginning because you should be aware what is set down as a requirement in suspensions and exclusions, because one of your tests when you come to consider them at a committee meeting is whether they were lawful. And so the school principal should be following this guidance. The important thing to say is that pupils should only be suspended or excluded, permanently excluded, on disciplinary grounds. So it's linked to their behaviour. The school can't suspend or exclude because of the actions of the parents, because the pupil has additional needs that the school can't meet, the academic ability or attainment of the pupil. And one key fact is that only the principal can suspend or permanently exclude. It's their decision. Now, there might be other people in the school that are involved in that. There probably are, but it's the principal's decision, and it's their name that goes at the bottom of the letter that informs the parents of the suspension or exclusion. And the other thing to note is that a suspension, or particularly a permanent exclusion, can significantly affect a young person's life chances. So I've never met a head teacher who takes it lightly. It is a huge decision, and proportionally there are more children in certain groups that get suspended and permanently excluded. So children with SEND, those from certain ethnic groups, looked after children, those on free school meals. So the school needs to be keeping an eye on who they are suspending and excluding. And that's why the there is this stage for review by governors in the process because it's such a serious decision. So there's built in there this review. And I'll just show you your own policy. So this is a much shorter read, but captures the key things that are required in suspensions and exclusions. It follows the DfE guidance, but as I say, it captures the salient points that you need to know. So just to explain the difference between a suspension and permanent exclusion, you see the definition there. A suspension, it used to be called a fixed term exclusion. The DfE has gone back to the word suspension, and it's for a defined period of time. I think in your trust you allow lunchtime suspensions, and it can be anything up from there. So, it could be 5 days, it could be 10 days, or it could be half a day. And it's a tool in the school's arsenal for dealing with behaviour. And your school's behaviour policy should set out that is one of the sanctions that you might impose. So you've probably got a whole series of sanctions that are internal. Suspension is the first external action you might take with a pupil. There is a limit of 45 days in the year over which you cannot suspend a pupil. So the school does need to be keeping a tally of how many days suspension a pupil has. And I've added DfE guidance onto the slides if you want to find where it actually gives you the details. A permanent exclusion is sort of what it says on the tin. It's permanently taking a child off roll of the school. There are 2 tests to this that your school principal should apply before making the decision to permanently exclude. So one is that it's in response to serious or persistent breaches of the school's behaviour policy. So a serious breach might be a one-off event with no lead up whatsoever, or it might be a lead up and then a serious event. So it might be carrying an offensive weapon, supplying an illegal drug, violent assault on another pupil or a member of staff. There are things you've probably got examples in your school's behaviour policy of when a permanent exclusion might be issued. Persistent breaches are where there's a build-up of behaviour, usually an escalation. So it might not end with a really serious breach, but it might be that there's been a track record of very challenging behaviour that's just got to the point where the school cannot cope with that young person anymore. So it has permanent exclusion has to meet that first test, and the principal must believe that there's a risk to allowing that young person to remain in school. And that might be a risk to them or a risk to others. And you see the words there, would seriously harm the education or welfare of the pupil or others. And it's really important. I'll come back to this later on when we talk about the Governor's Discipline Committee, because you need to satisfy yourselves as a committee that the principal has met both of those and express that in the outcome letter. One thing it's worth saying is you can't convert a suspension into permanent exclusion. So if the pupil has been suspended, so sometimes this happens, you might suspend a pupil, there's been something serious has happened, you need time as a school to gather witness statements to figure out what's happened. So you might suspend the pupil immediately pending investigation. Now, at the end of that suspension, you might decide to permanently exclude, but what you can't do is during that suspension say, right, we're turning it into a permanent exclusion. It has to be a separate decision and a very clear demarcation between the suspension and the permanent exclusion. And there are responsibilities following a PX. I'll say PX rather than permanent exclusion because it's a bit of a mouthful. Or suspension. So there are responsibilities on the principal to inform various parties, and also it says the governing board and the local authority have responsibilities to arrange education, but in practice, it's not the governing board doing that. Obviously, but strictly speaking, the governing board has a duty to ensure it's happening, that the pupil is provided with education. And there's lots of detail to that, which I won't go into because it's you'll never remember it all, but it's you know where to find it in the DFE guidance. Those are all the slides on suspension and exclusion. Are there any questions before I move on to the governor's discipline panel? Kevin.
You're on mute, Kevin.
Yep, sorry, trying to come off mute. I've got a new screen. I couldn't find the microphone button. Yeah, Kathy, what happens if the 45 days is exceeded or needs to be exceeded?
Well, you can't suspend beyond 45 days.
So what happens? Do they get?
I think before you get there, as a school, you've probably investigated lots of other things like circuit breaks, managed moves, alternative provision.
Yeah, so you've never known it happen then?
Well, no, you're not allowed to, so you can't.
No, but if they need to suspend them again, but they've reached 45 days, what is the process? Is there a process, or it's never happened before? There's no precedent, or?
No, I'm sure schools have reached that, but I think you probably end up permanently excluding if you've got to that point.
That's the only option, yeah.
Yeah,
it's a lot of days. It's a lot of days, that is. So
yeah,
you have to be something really serious.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, 45 days is a huge amount of school missed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are thresholds. You'll see it when we get to the committee and what triggers a committee. There are thresholds set if they go over 15 days in a term, that the suspensions have to, or the last suspension has to be reviewed, because 15 days in a term is a huge amount.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Right, let's on to the next section. So now turn to the Governor's Discipline Panel, the GDC, which is what your trust calls the. I keep calling them panels because we call them exclusion panels, but I'll try and remember that you call them GDCs. Now they review all permanent exclusions and some suspensions. And you'll see there the test that you are making as a committee, whether the principal's decision to suspend or exclude was lawful, reasonable, and procedurally fair. And when we get on to how you make that decision, I'll guide you to where Diverse Academies has got a whole set of questions you can ask yourselves as a panel to help guide you, because those are quite big areas. And the questions that are provided by your trust help you get under the skin of those. It has to meet for a permanent exclusion, as I say. It also has to meet if a pupil will miss a public exam or a national curriculum test. And it has to meet if the suspension, it takes it over 15 days total in the term. And then there's also this, if there's between 5 and 15 days in the term and the parents make representations, then you also have to have a panel meeting. Now, you would expect your governance professional to be keeping an eye on this along with the school. So the school should be keeping a tally of how many days suspension that child has. And the school should be flagging up when they hit that threshold or when there's been a permanent exclusion. And I assume what happens in your trust is the school then works with the governance professional who then organises the committee meeting. So if you're a governor on this call, you won't need to get involved in that. It's just to be aware that there are different circumstances in which a panel has to meet. And you probably can't read all the details there, but it's to show you there's a flow chart in the DFE guidance which I keep referring to because I find I can't keep it all in my head with what you have to do for different circumstances. But basically, if there are fewer than 15 days suspension, then you don't necessarily have to have a panel, and it's only triggered if parents make representations. There are rules about timescales in the DfE guidance. So normally the Governor's Discipline Committee has to meet within 15 school days of receiving the notice within 15 school days of the governing body receiving the notice of suspension or permanent exclusion. I tend to take it from the day of the suspension or permanent exclusion. It does extend to 50 school days if you've got between 5 and 15 days suspensions. So you've got 10 school weeks there to arrange it. But the 15 school days is quite a short period because you want to get, well, the governance professional and the school will be getting a pack together of information to share with the panel. I tend to organise the date in the third week of the 3 weeks to give people time to do that, but it depends on people's availability. If you can't meet that deadline, it doesn't negate the process. If you go over the 15 school days, for instance, it still means you can have a valid committee meeting with a decision, but you should take every effort to arrange it within the 15 school days. And it's probably the governance professional who's working and contacting the parents to arrange it and liaising with the school as well to organise for which leaders are going to be available when. As long as you keep in contact with those people, and particularly the parents, and explain, I just can't get everybody together. So, I've had circumstances when parents say, oh, I can only do a Friday afternoon. So it means you're immediately cutting down the options and you can't find a Friday afternoon that the principal can also do in that 3-week period. So maybe you go into the following week. As long as you've explained to the parents why that is, then that's okay. You have 3 members normally of the Governor's Discipline Committee, and in your trust they may be made up of representatives from your Academy Council, isn't it, or Academy Committee of the school where the suspension or exclusion is, or it might be governors from other schools in your trust, or it might be trustees, so you might have a mixture. And they must be untainted, so they mustn't have had any contact with the discussions about that child before. Discussions about their exclusion or suspension before. The example is if the principal has had a conversation with the chair of governors, for instance, about what they're going to do about that child. So strictly speaking, that chair shouldn't then be on the committee. You'll need somebody to chair the committee meeting. That'll be one of the 3 governors who are on the committee. Usually they are appointed in advance so that they can prepare themselves, and it's probably the person who's got the most experience on such committees, so the person who's most comfortable doing it. And you need somebody to clerk the meeting. That'll be your governance professional usually, or it might be a governance professional from another school, and they will organise the meeting, ensure everyone's got the papers, provide procedural advice to the committee, take notes, draft the decision letter. And I find in our trust that I have different approaches from different schools. Some of them expect me to circulate all the papers if I'm clerking the meeting. Others will set up their own SharePoint area, and I provide the contact details of the 3 governors who are going to be on the committee, and they then send a link out to those governors. So it depends how your school and governance professional work together on how you share the information. So I've got a scenario for you here. You're a governor due to be on a governor's disciplinary committee. On seeing the papers, you realise you know the parent of the excluded pupil. What do you do? Do you do A, continue on the GDC as you've already prepared? B, step down immediately and ask the governance professional to replace you with a governor with no link to the parent? Or C, discuss with the governance professional whether they think this will be a conflict of interest or possibly cause problems in the GDC? So I haven't really thought through how I was going to get you to respond to this because you turned your videos off. If you want to turn your videos off for a minute, back on for a minute, I'll get you to put your hands up to get a feeling for how many think it's. So you can put your hand. I'll call out A, B, and C in turn, and then you can put your hands up to. Unless you're feeling confident about putting your hand up with Teams. Right, anybody want to go for A, that you're going to continue? No, nobody wants to do A. Anyone want to go for B? So step down immediately and be replaced. So I've got 1 there, 2, 3. Yeah, so I've got quite a few there. Yeah. Anyone go for C? Discuss with the governance professional. Yeah, I've got a few there as well. Yeah, I should have said there's not necessarily one right answer to this. I think that those of you who said B or C, I think they're both valid. I know when I delivered some training on exclusion panels to diverse academies, it was before COVID, and when I came up with this scenario, somebody said that they're a governor in quite a small village school and said they know everybody in the village, and so probably just about every parent at the school. So it'd be very difficult to avoid being known. So I think you might well have a chat with the governance professional. You might go for C to see whether you think it's going to be a problem. It depends how well you know them. If you just know them, you recognise them in the street, then it might not be an issue. But if they're your next door neighbour, then, or somebody you go drinking with down the pub on a regular basis, then you might feel uncomfortable with that. And the key with all of this is that you are, even if you think you could give a fair hearing, if there was any suspicion from the parents, say that they wouldn't get a fair hearing from you, or a suspicion from the principal that you might be partial to the parent, then you shouldn't be on the panel. So it should be seen to be fair as well as be fair. Right, I'll carry on. So there's I haven't got another scenario for a few slides, so you're okay to go back on. Turn off your cameras if you want.
Can I come in on that? Sorry, Kathy, I did put my hand up.
Yes, certainly, Pete.
Yeah, I've just in my head, I'm thinking that I've been a governor for a long time in different trusts and that you get to know parents and carers quite well, especially like you say, if it's a small village or it's a small trust and that. And I think for me, talking with the governance professional makes sense in that thing, because we're not going to get away from not knowing the parents, and particularly if you live in that village as well. Whereas myself, I'm aloof from some of the areas I cover, but you do get to know parents because you go to parents' evenings, you go to any fundraising events that's happening and all things like that. You get to talk to parents, particularly around what's happening within the academy and how they feel. So I think there's a thing in my head that we all get to know parents, and it comes back to what you said: how well do we know that parent?
Yeah, certainly. And because you're in a trust, you can volunteer for committees in other schools. And if, in that conversation with the governance professional, you agreed that actually this could be seen as a conflict of interest, or it might make your life uncomfortable. You might feel uncomfortable going in the local pub or down to the local shop if you thought you might bump into this parent later on. So you could have a conversation with the governance profession about whether they could find somebody from another school or a governor from another school to be on the panel.
Yeah.
And I think that's the benefit of being in the trust, where you've actually set that down as that's something that you can do as a matter of course.
Thank you.
The people who have to be invited to the GDC meeting are the parents, the pupil if they're 18 or older, the head teacher or the principal, the LA representative. I think that's, you're across more than one LA, and I think there are different responses from the LAs. I hear some of them insist on a representative coming to all PXs and all suspension meetings. Others don't, but they have they could do. So you inform them of when the meeting is going to happen. You have to invite the child social worker and the virtual school head. So that's if they're a looked after child, if they have those. So I have a checklist if I'm clerking a meeting, and one of the first things I ask the school when they tell me there's a PX or a suspension is, does the child have a social worker and or a virtual school head? So I know to include them in my arranging. The people who might attend are the pupil. Now that's something for the parents and the school to agree. I would have said if they were secondary age, then no problem about them coming. If they're primary age, perhaps year 6, any younger, probably not appropriate. Sometimes parents want to bring their child because they want them to hear what the school is saying. Sometimes they want to bring them so their child can speak for themselves. And if that happens, then if you're chairing a committee, it's important to ask the child if they have anything to say and make them feel comfortable as well to do that, because it might be a bit scary for them. The parents can bring a family friend or representative. Quite recently, I had a CAMS representative brought in, and tomorrow I've got a permanent exclusion hearing, and the mother has asked if her son's mental health support worker from the local authority can join the meeting to give a bit more context. What you wouldn't expect is anyone to bring a lawyer or a solicitor with them, because it's not a legal process. So, I think if they did ask, then you probably take advice from your own lawyers about how you might rebuff that. Since COVID, during COVID, the DFE allowed online meetings, and since then they've added into the guidance that you can have remote meetings if the parents request them. So when I'm setting up a meeting, I always ask the parents, you have the right to attend. Do you want it in person or online? And so the one tomorrow is online. So it's great. I didn't have any problem getting panel members. But you must check that if you're arranging the meeting, that the parents, if they do request remote, that they can access it. They've got the technology to access it and the bandwidth. But they shouldn't be pressured. So the default is for in-person meetings. The social worker and the virtual school head can join remotely if everybody else is together in a room. But apart from that, you can't have hybrid meetings. And it is worth saying also, I didn't say on the previous slide, if the parents don't want to come, the meeting goes ahead. It means it's quicker because they're not there, but you still have to have the meeting, because you are, as a committee, you are reviewing the principal's decision to suspend or exclude, and you still need to go through that process. And I've already mentioned, this is the first principle, that it's important that the committee meeting is fair and seen to be fair for all parties. And part of that is that the written material is seen by everyone in attendance. That's the panel or the committee, the parents, the school will already have seen it, but you will have a pack of information, and that should be the same for everyone. So there's one meeting I went to when I was clerking, and the school came in beforehand and said to the panel, can we show you something that we don't want to share with the parents? So as the governance professional, I said, no, you cannot do that. If you're going to show it, you have to show it to the parents as well. You'll have an agenda which should give both parties a chance to speak and to ask questions, and I'll show you typically what's in an agenda in a minute. And the whole point there is that everyone does have that opportunity. And sometimes I've seen committee chairs saying at the end to the parents, do you feel you've been able to say all you want to say? Do you feel you've had a fair hearing? And I think the other thing it's important to say is that you, as the three people on the GDC, have collective responsibility. You're not taking a decision on your own. You're coming to, I mean, you might vote, and the point of having three is that if you don't all agree, then you can have a majority decision. But I haven't been on one panel for over the 8 years I've been doing them where we haven't had a unanimous decision. So usually after a bit of discussion and a bit of toing and froing with our discussions. And you do need to prepare for the meetings. That means you getting the papers in enough time to read them. And I always build in 30 minutes pre-meet. I think you do as well in your trust, so that the panel arrives with me, the governance professional, before the meeting. And it's a chance for the panel to discuss what they've read, what lines of questioning they might have, and if they've got any questions about the process, I can advise as the governance professional. And it's worth being aware also that parents probably don't attend formal meetings of this sort regularly, and some of them might never have attended such a meeting, and they don't really know what to expect. I mean, I do share the agenda with them in advance, and if somebody is sounding very worried, I might have a chat with them in advance, but they're not used to this, whereas you as governors are used to more formal meetings. So it's just worth saying that you need to work on making them feel comfortable. There are other things that can go wrong though, and I've had parents who are not together anymore, who start arguing with each other in the meeting. So it's quite important to remember that you can always adjourn the meeting for people to calm down, or to, if they get upset, to calm down from that. I've mentioned the pack that you have as a GDC. So this is a snippet of the list in, I think it's in your suspension and exclusion policy for the trust. And the pack is stored on SharePoint, and the link will be sent to all of the panel members or the committee members in advance of the meeting. And the pack will include a report from the school, and that'll have information in such as details about the pupil, whether they've got special educational needs, external agency involvement, pastoral support plan, their attendance, behaviour, mitigating circumstances, and most importantly, the reason for the PX or the suspension and the actions the school has taken. So that's your key bit of information. It may include statements, but if they're pupil statements, they will be anonymised. So the statements are particularly used when it's a one-off serious behaviour breach. So the principal should have come to a decision on the balance of probabilities whether the pupil did what they were accused of doing, and witness statements will be part of that evidence pack. You normally get information about, oh, sorry, Pete, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just about statements, really. I sit with, not just with DAT, but I sit in other trusts as well, on panels, and quite often we get statements that are typed out that students have written, or supposed to have written, but they're not signed or dated. And in my mind, that I'm not quite sure who has written them, unless you see the paper ones that's been written by students, and yeah, you don't see the thing, but you know they've signed it and there's a date to it as well. So are they admissible if they're not been signed or dated?
Yeah, I would expect the date to be included because that's not personal data. I would expect statements to be anonymised, but if
Yeah, which they are,
if
but not
yeah,
all
if
of them
the
are dated. Yeah.
yeah, a date would make sense. So you'd know whether they were made straight after the event or 10 days later. But the committee should have the right to ask to inspect original statements. So they wouldn't be shared with the parents, but they might be available to inspect if you wanted to satisfy yourselves that what's typed up matches the original statements. I mean, sometimes they're typed up for legibility, and sometimes so
Yeah,
that
I get that, but
handwriting can't
yeah,
be
yeah,
can't
I
be
get that,
recognized.
but I want to see the originals as well.
Yeah, so I have heard of that being done where maybe the panel chair or the committee chair is shown them separately, but they're not shown to everybody.
No, okay, thank you.
Kathy, we also have Anna with her hand up as well.
Yeah, hi Anna.
Hi, Kathy. Just a quick question about the packs. So if we were to do a 15.5 day, and we would have a panel meeting, what would you expect to see in that in terms of the chronology? Would you expect to just see that last suspension and that's all? Because obviously that's what the governors would be reviewing. Or would you expect to see a more in-depth chronology with information supporting other suspensions that have led up to that final one that's taken them over the 15.5 days?
Yeah, so just to clarify to everyone, if it's over 15 days in the term, then you have to have a panel. But the committee meeting, sorry, I'll get the nomenclature right in the end. The committee is reviewing the latest suspension, the suspension that took the pupil over 15 days. I would expect sort of bit of detail in that final suspension, but maybe some context with some detail about or a list of the other suspensions. I've seen more information about suspensions where it's a permanent exclusion for persistent breaches, and I've seen quite a bit in the pack. I don't know. Have you got a view, Alison? Because I think I'd want to see a list of suspensions so I can see that what's happening, but also I think the actions from the school after those. So I've seen a list where it's, suspension there, reintegration meeting, this is what we agreed with the parents and the pupil, another suspension. So I could see what the school was doing and that they were trying lots of different things.
So would you just expect to see that in a chronology rather than actual then written sort of minutes from meetings with parents? Sorry, I've just realised my camera's off. That's really rude. Apologies. Or would you be fine with, would you sort of just expect in terms of suspension and then actions from reintegration meeting, a youth justice referral or an MHST referral or AP or whatever?
I think the latter. I don't think you need lots of detail for a 15 plus, but I think you probably need more detail in if it's a permanent exclusion, but for persistent breaches where you'd probably be using that history of their behaviour and all those suspensions as your justificate or your evidence for your belief that they are a risk to allow to stay in school.
Thank you.
Alison, were you going to say?
Yeah, no, just to say I agree with that. I think if you're doing it on persistent behaviour, you need to be showing what you've done in between, like the first suspension, what interventions might have been put in place, those might have broken down, so you then did another suspension. But I think just in a chronology is fine for that. As Kathy said, though, for permanent exclusion, you really need to go into a bit more detail and perhaps have minutes and letters sent to parents in between, etc.
Yeah, thank you both.
And I think it's worth saying that for a suspension review where you've gone over 15 days, it's effectively a facilitated discussion between the principal or the school leaders and the parents. about the support, because if you've got to 15 days in the term, something isn't working. Now, it might be that the school's tried everything they can and that it's just not the right place for the child. I've seen it quite a few times where children have special educational needs and really should be in a different setting. The school is trying everything they can, but within a mainstream setting, it's just not working. That child can't function, and it's being displayed in their behaviour. So with the 15 days plus suspension, what often happens is the child is already back in school, because by the time you have the meeting, the suspension has expired. So from a practical point of view, it doesn't make any difference what your decision is, other than it would change the child's record. But it's quite an opportunity for the parents to discuss with the school about next steps, and perhaps a reminder by the school of what their expectations are. But I've had chats with Alison about this, that it seems a waste of 3 governors, doesn't it? Really, that, you could have that discussion anyway, couldn't you? Well, sorry, there was one thing I just remembered that I didn't say. When I said you have to invite the head teacher or the principal to the meeting, you can have other school leaders there. Quite often, where I've clocked a permanent exclusion or it's a 15-day suspension, we've had a vice principal or an assistant principal there. So it might be the person who leads on behaviour at the school is there. So the principal is there because they made the final decision, but actually the AP for behaviour knows the case much more, knows the family, knows all the detail. So they're there as well, and they do a double act. D.
Hi, thank you, Kathy. I'm not going to turn my camera on because I'm sitting in a car in the dark, so you wouldn't see me anyway. You touched on something that's really interesting, and it's the thing that worries me most about exclusions, particularly permanent exclusions, and that's that synergy, that connection between special needs and behaviour. So we can't, and a school shouldn't exclude on the grounds of special needs. However, it's often the special needs, usually identified special needs, that's led to the behaviour that's led to this happening in the first place. So that for me is the worry about how, how you sort of look at an exclusion. It's like that balance between special needs and behaviour. And is it one, is it the other? And yeah, so is there any sort of guidance around that?
I don't know that there's any written down guidance, but you'd expect the school to have made reasonable adjustments for that pupil and to have consulted with external agencies. So it might be, I've had quite a number of permanent exclusions where the child has been diagnosed with SEMH, social and emotional mental health needs, and the school will say, we got the local authority SEMH team in to do an assessment and gave us recommendations. And usually they say, well, we're already doing those, because we know what we're doing. So you'd expect to see all of that. So I think it's, the exclusion is still based on behaviour, but you'd expect them to have done everything they can to avoid it. And it's the absolute last resort. But sometimes it is, as you say, due to behaviour that results from their special educational needs. And it's really sad because I guess you're the same in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, a shortage of special school places, and schools are dealing with some quite high needs in young people. Sorry, I don't know if that really answers your question, but
thank you.
It
does. It's so look for the school having made as many reasonable adjustments as they can to try and support the student. And just a quick follow on, if you don't mind. If the student's already been placed in alternative provision because of their special needs, and that placement falls flat and they get excluded from that, are they excluded from the alternative placement or from the school that owns them?
I think it's the school, their home school, because that school, they're still on roll at the home school, which has commissioned the AP.
Thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you for that. Thank you.
I think just picking up on the special educational needs as well, if the student's got an EHCP, I think I would want to see that the school are making efforts to try and get that reviewed as well, to make sure that the section within it that says about the help and everything that the children need, it has actually been explored. Does that need updating? Is that still relevant, etc.? So just, you know, see that there are those discussions going on with the local authority about that. Pete, you've got your hand up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to come in on the SEN and SEND and EHCPs as well. My experience in the past has been, checking to see what the school's done, whether AP's worked or not. But there have been occasions where local authorities will agree with principals that the only right move is permanent exclusion because we can't cater for their needs. I've worked in inclusion and disability for about 25 years now, and neurodiversity, and it depends where they are on the spectrums, autistic and ADHD, and depends what they've got. And I've always had this thing in my head that just because somebody's got a condition like that doesn't mean to say they have to be a naughty child or use that as an excuse. And again, it comes out EHCPs, they're getting very tight and very long-winded before they come through. And I've been on a panel recently where one came out 2 days before the panel met, and that was brought up. And I was a bit concerned about that because it did sway the decision, and it ended up being a majority to reinstate, which wasn't good for the academy. Not in Diverse Academy Trust, I might add. So it is a worry, and it's lack of knowledge and experience for people in that area, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I understand that on your SharePoint area there is advice on SEND and looked after children. Alison informs me, so there's further advice to help you and understand if you realise when you're reading the pack that the child who's been excluded or suspended has those additional needs.
Yeah, that's right. What we have actually done as well is have a look at where parents of children with special educational needs can go to disability discrimination panels as well, and just had a look at the questions that they might be looking for in those panels so that we can address them in our meetings beforehand, so that if that does happen, although touch wood, thankfully it hasn't to date, you know, we have hopefully addressed everything that a disability panel might look for.
I'm just going back to Pete's point. You're right that because there's a backlog of children whose EHCPs name special school as the suitable placement for them, and so those children are in mainstream school. Sometimes it's the only way to get them into a special school is by permanently excluding them. That's the system is broken, and that's the way it works. And I don't think it means that principals take that decision any less likely, but less likely or more likely because of that. But it's just something that permanent exclusion can accelerate their pathway to a special school, possibly. Just going back to the pack for a minute, as Anna was asking about what should go in the pack, if it's a permanent exclusion due to a serious breach of the behaviour policy, you'd expect quite a bit of information about the incident. And as I say, witness statements. I've seen a really nice pack or good pack where there was a narrative written, and then whoever had written it would say, a student said they heard so and so say X, Y, and Z, reference witness statement E, so that you could go to witness statement, but you got a narrative which summarised what had happened. Now, if it's a serious breach, you might get a history of behaviour, but that isn't relevant to that first test of where it's a serious breach. The other previous behaviour is not relevant to that, but the principal might include previous behaviour to justify the second test, the belief that it's a risk to allow that young person to remain in school. So you've got to be quite careful about what you use in the pack and how you use it, and being really, as the committee, focus on the reason for the permanent exclusion. Was it serious or was it persistent breaches, and assess it relative to that. Right, back to the PowerPoint. So I've got another scenario for you. You are a governor on a GDC which is assembled in the room before the hearing is due to start. The principal pops in and asks to have a quick word with the governors about an unrelated matter. What do you do? A, let the principal have a quick word and let her stay until the hearing starts. B, let her have a quick word but ensure she leaves before the hearing starts. Or C, suggest that she discusses this unrelated matter after the hearing. So, would anyone go for A? I can't see most of you, but
no.
Pete's shaking his head quite vehemently. Anyone go for B? Let her have a quick word and then leave. No, you're quite sure about this. How about C? You're going to go for C? Yeah. Yeah, you're quite right. Yeah, and the key here is that that perception of fairness, because the principal might be talking about something completely different, but if the parents came around the corner then and saw the principal talking to the committee, there could be a perception of collusion, and those parents need to believe that they're getting a fair hearing. And so it leads me on to saying that it's important to manage people coming to the meeting carefully. It's usually somebody in the school or the governance professional who'll manage that. So once the panel, the committee is ready to start, they will give the nod, and then the parents and the school representatives should be brought in at the same time. In particular, you should never have the school representatives in the room with the committee without the parents present. So we're now ready to start the committee meeting. Everybody's arrived, they're all settled in the room, and everyone's introduced themselves. The chair now will do an introduction, and I've just put down my suggestion of what the chair would say at the beginning. I actually have a script for my chairs to try and persuade them to chair it. You'd explain the purpose of the meeting, what decisions the panel can come to, point out the agenda and how it gives everyone a chance to speak and ask questions. Remind everyone that they can request an adjournment if they wish, and remind everyone to turn their phones off or onto silent. And here's a typical agenda. And I suppose one thing to say is that as a committee member, you probably won't say very much, because you only come in when you're asking questions. So there and there. And some of the questions you've thought of might get answered when the school management presents. Another thing to bear in mind is when the school management starts off, because it's the person who has initiated the meeting starts. So it's the principal or the school leader who's there, because it's the decision to suspend or exclude has sparked the need for this meeting. So they'll present. Now, sometimes they'll want to read the whole of their report. I usually say to the chair or say to the committee before we start, if you're happy to say to the principal, take it as read, that report. We've all had it in advance. We've all read it. Would you like to just summarise? Particularly when it's about 6 pages long, you think that's quite a good move. If it's very brief, you might get them to read it. So you as the committee can control the meeting. And so after they've presented, the chair will invite the parents to ask questions, and then the rest of the committee. Well, if you three members of the committee can ask questions, and then the parents present about anything they want to, about their response to the exclusion or suspension. And again, questions. Sorry, I've put parents there. It should be questions from the school management and then from the GDC. It's quite important to give people the chance for final comments. So is there anything else you feel you haven't had a chance to say, or do you want to summarise? And then they all leave apart from the GDC and the governance professional, and the GDC reaches a decision. That's the ideal agenda. Doesn't always go to plan. What I've found sometimes is the school starts speaking here and the parents interrupt. They start asking questions or making statements. When you get to questions from the parents, they start making statements. It's up to you as the chair if you want to let it run or whether you want to stick strictly to the agenda. Your aim is to ensure everyone gets a chance to speak and ask questions. So if it doesn't quite follow the agenda, but it's going all right and it's a bit of a dialogue, then I advise the chair to let it run. Particularly happens with the 15+ days suspension, where, as I said earlier, it's more of a facilitated discussion between the parents and the school about what support they've given, what the impact was, what they could do next. So it's, I think you can be flexible, but if it's not going right and it's got a bit derailed and there's lots of interruptions, as a chair, you might insist on following the agenda so that there's some discipline in the meeting. So when the GDC has reached a decision, if it's a permanent exclusion, I always say to the committee, you can, I say to the chair in advance, you can give the parents the option of waiting and coming back in and hearing the decision verbally, because a permanent exclusion, if you don't uphold it, that could make a difference immediately to that child. They could be back in school the next day. But whether they stay around for the decision or not, you should get, or your governance professional should get the decision letter out quickly. If it's a 15-day suspension panel, then you wouldn't get them to wait around, because that's not going to make, unless they're still on suspension, but it's probably unlikely. So it's not going to make a practical difference to them, to that child. But it's up to you as a committee whether you feel comfortable bringing them back in for the decision. You'd bring the school representatives in at the same time. Oh, I've got another scenario for you. You're the chair of the panel for a GDC. The parent has brought a written statement which has not been submitted in advance. What do you do? Do you A, refuse to accept the statement? B, allow the parent to read it out in the meeting? Or C, take copies of the statement for everyone and adjourn the meeting for a short time to give everyone time to read it?
C for me, Kathy. I'll start it off.
Okay.
D.
Was that B from someone?
Oh, that was a C.
Oh, that was a C, right.
That was a C.
Yeah, C from me as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you probably would. I mean, if it's quite short, you might go for B. It's a bit of a judgment call. I usually, in the invitation to the committee meeting, I would always say in my invitation letter, you can submit to the parents, you can submit any further paperwork in advance, but get it to me as soon as possible so I can share it. But parents don't tend to do that. They, as I said earlier, they don't, they haven't attended lots of these formal meetings, so they don't know what to expect. And I think some of them think the night before, I better just jot down some notes. So they might bring some handwritten notes. Some might have typed something out. So if it's quite short, you could get them to read it out in the meeting. But yeah, if it's longer, then definitely go for C, take copies. The governance professional should see if they can get a copy of it if they read it out, so that the governance professional doesn't have to capture all of it in their notes as they're going through. Right, you've had the committee meeting now. You've heard from both sides. Everyone's had a chance to ask questions. I think, going back to that agenda, if people say, "Oh, I forgot to say this and it's not my turn," or "I forgot to ask this question earlier, is it all right if I ask it?" I think that's fine, but not to the extent that they're going on and on and on. But if they do forget to say something in that slot, then it doesn't matter if they ask it later. So the school representatives and the parents have left now, and you are discussing as a committee what you think of what you've heard. Now, in your trust questions for the GDC, you've got a list of questions you can ask yourselves. So these aren't necessarily questions you'd ask in the meeting, but they're questions you'd ask yourselves when you're sitting down deliberating. And I've just put a few of the questions down there as examples. And that penultimate one, were there any mitigating factors? So that might come through in the principal's report on the exclusion or suspension, or it might be something that comes up, parents raise it. And that last one, I've already mentioned that has the principal considered or already used other options? So really, have they exhausted everything, particularly if it's a permanent exclusion? And these are the decisions you can make. You've got one of two decisions. You can reinstate the pupil or uphold the exclusion or suspension. And as I've said earlier, if they've been suspended and they're back in school, you can still take a decision to reinstate them, and that's effectively to say that last suspension, we don't uphold it. So a note would be put on that pupil's record to that effect. And I've mentioned that second big bullet point is that there is guidance on the SharePoint area of various things, including if a pupil has SEND or is a looked after child. Your decision is on the balance of probabilities. So that's the principal has taken a decision on the balance of probabilities when they decided to suspend or exclude. And you are as well. So what do you believe happened? Particularly relevant if it's a permanent exclusion due to a serious breach. So it might be there was something happened, serious incident. There are different views. It might be that the excluded pupil gives a different version to all your witness statements. But if all your witness statements corroborate, you might decide actually that we believe the witness statements rather than the excluded pupil. And you're testing out there, was the decision to exclude or suspend lawful, reasonable and procedurally fair? So lawful, did the principal follow the guidance? Now, your governance professional should be able to help you if you've got questions about that. Was it reasonable? So it might be a first offence and it was them being rude to a member of staff. You might think that a permanent exclusion for that was unreasonable, was over the top. And was it procedurally fair? So an example of that is, it was many years ago, so I think it's one of my first permanent exclusions. The young person did assault a member of staff. He was suspended and the school didn't allow the suspension to play out. They got witness statements and decided to permanently exclude, but they didn't give the excluded student a chance to give his side of the story. So he was quite heightened on the day and they suspended him. He went home. What they should have done was given him a chance to give a statement the following day when he calmed down. And they could have done that by asking his mother to take a statement and to give it to the school. He didn't have to come into school to do it, but they didn't. And we did uphold the exclusion at the panel. And then it failed at the next stage of the appeal. Pete.
Yeah, just a question about around equitable in the sense that if it's a child that's on SEN register or EHCP, because I know the IRP panels have overturned things because a child's linked to SEN as an EHCP because it's not been equitable within the panel. So I noticed that's missing, but it has been used in other panels that I sit on.
So equitable
in the sense fairness, because of possibility of the child on the autistic spectrum or things like that, and it's part of their, and it's whether it's actually been taken into account. There was one last year that was sent back, and the IRP said that the student needs reinstated because none of that was taken into consideration. So EDI wasn't anything there at all, and nothing mentioned. So it's something that I know came out and we had to be aware of with that.
Yeah, and that's quite often a panel will ask, or a committee will ask, if there's no evidence of SEND in the paperwork they've had, they might say, is there any identified SEND for this child, just to check if it's not been mentioned. But yes, you should be exploring what those additional needs can lead to as far as behaviour goes.
It's same as when you see on documents that they put the letter K around that, and then they talk about SEMH, but then they don't explain that. But we know it's social, emotional, mental health, which is actually growing massively within mainstream schools and also others. So it's a bit of a minefield in that context, and I think we need to look at getting that right.
Yeah.
I think as well, to that end, in our template minutes as well, we have got a heading about SEND as well, so that we do note if there is no SEND, or actually, you know, what the discussions have been within the SEND and the considerations being given as well. Because I think it's equally as important to note that there has been no SEND or no, you know, equitable information that we need to talk about. So that is on our standard minute template now.
Thank you.
I've covered this a bit already, but I just wanted to reiterate that if you have a permanent exclusion that you're reviewing, it's really important that the GDC does consider both of those tests for a permanent exclusion and expresses that, and your governance professional captures it in your decision letter and the minutes. So you're showing why you've concluded that you agree with both of those if you do uphold the permanent exclusion. So it might be that, yes, you can see that the escalating behaviour. So that second test around risk, it might be that you've seen escalating behaviour, that you accept the principal's argument that, you know, this child coming in carrying a weapon has raised concerns that next time they might do it and actually use the weapon. So it might be something like that. But, you know, I've also heard arguments where the principal has said that child has created a culture of fear because they're not following instructions, they're defiant, they're verbally abusive. And the other pupils are seeing that child is out of control and the adults around them in the school cannot control them. So that's creating a culture of fear that's affecting the education and the well-being of those other children. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a direct threat of violence. It can be, you know, a more nuanced argument. But it's really important that you articulate that and it's captured in the records. So I've already said about how you can invite the parents back in to hear the decision verbally, but usually I would only do that with a permanent exclusion. I've talked about the outcome letter a bit. Do you have template outcome letters, Alison?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been involved in discussions on governance networks about how much detail you put in outcome letters as well. Particularly important for permanent exclusions to really have that rationale of why you've made the decision, because permanent exclusions have a right of appeal. The minutes, in my experience, they're They're quite detailed. You're capturing the questions that are asked, because if it goes to appeal, the review panel will be looking for evidence that the panel challenged the decision and asked questions about it. So that should be evidenced in the minutes. In my experience, I tend to write governing body minutes that are more of a, not quite a summary, but summarise some things, but I would put more detail into my GDC minutes. And the decision letter and the minutes should be provided to the school so they can put them on the child's record. Confidentiality is really important. So it's normally, as governors, you're dealing with summary data. You're not dealing with lots of sensitive data about individuals. But here you are. You will have information about a child's send, their behaviour, maybe medical needs. So it's really important that you treat these papers confidentially. They'll be shared on SharePoint with you. If you have printed copies, then normally you hand them in at the end of the meeting to the governance professional so that they can be shredded. But it's just bearing in mind that there's a lot of personal data and sensitive data in these documents. So you need to look after them and be very careful with what you do with them. I've got one more scenario. I think it's the last one. You're the chair of a GDC where the pupil has accompanied their parents. During the hearing, the pupil gets out their phone and appears to be playing something on it. What do you do? A, ask the pupil to put their phone away. B, allow them to play with their phone. Or C, stop the hearing. Anyone go for A? Ask them to put their phone away. Yeah. Elaine's gone for A. Yeah.
Start with that one. Yeah.
Nod from Gareth. Yep. Anyone go for B? Allow them to play with their phone. No takers for that one. Stop the hearing. C. Kevin's going for that one. Yeah.
I think for me, I would look at the situation that firstly I'd want to make sure that they weren't recording anything. However, if the child's getting irritable and whatever, if it's a tool that's used to calm the child down and it is just to play a game on silent, then I wouldn't have a problem with that.
Yeah, that's a good point, Pete. Yeah, this happened to me years ago. I had a water jug between me and I was chairing it, and a water jug, so I couldn't see what was happening, but the assistant principal could see and told the pupil to put their phone away. But yeah, but your point about recording is really important. So they're meant to have phones off or on silent, but you do need to be careful about recording. So normally in any sort of panel or committee meeting, I wouldn't allow people to record. When the parents go out, if you're allowing them to come back in to hear the decision, get them to take all their belongings out just in case. It's perhaps I'm just very suspicious, but just in case they left a phone recording to hear the panel's deliberations. So get them to take everything with them. It's just being careful, isn't it?
Definitely.
Right, we're getting towards the end now. So that's everything on the governor's discipline panel. And I'm just about to go on to a few slides on what happens if parents appeal your decision as the panel. Any questions on the keep calling them panels, sorry, committee? Right. The only circumstances where parents can appeal is permanent exclusions. They don't have a right to appeal if you've had a committee to review suspensions. And it's called an independent review panel. And that gives you a clue as to that it's independent. So there won't be anybody on there that is a part of your trust. There'll be people from external, and trusts do different things. Some engage the local authority to provide them, but there are lots of organisations now that are set up to provide them. Some trusts try and organise them themselves, which, you know, if you've got a bank of people to call on, then that's possible. I'm keeping my fingers crossed because I haven't had an IRP for years, and I'm hoping it stays that way. And the parents have to appeal within 15 school days. And the letter that your governance professional drafts for you, your decision letter at the end of your GDC, should include a bit at the end about their right to appeal and how they go about appealing, who they contact for that. And the IRP can't overturn the exclusion. They review the GDC's decision, and I'll tell you what decisions they can come to in the next slide. Usually the chair of the GDC would attend the IRP meeting, and the head teacher, principal, and the parents. And there are quite strict rules about IRP membership and training. So instead of being 3 governors, there's usually a current or recently retired governor, head teacher, and then a lay person. And they have to have had recent training as well on IRPs. And the IRP can take one of 3 decisions. So one is to uphold the decision you took at the GDC stage. And the next 2 are where they find some problem with your decision. Number 2 is to recommend that the governing body reconsiders. And number 3 is more serious. It's quashing the decision and directing the governing body to consider the exclusion again. So number 2, in theory, you could choose not to do that, but I think you'd be on shaky grounds. But number 3, you have to reconsider. And just to give you an idea of the tests for quashing, there's illegality, irrationality, and procedural impropriety. So they're quite high tests for quashing. And I think normally well, I've been trained to be on an IOP. We start with that one, the worst. Say it does. Do we think it's this? No, right. We'll go down to the next level. I've done a slide there, but I won't go into this in detail. But I've been gathering experiences from our MAT governance network about what people do, about whether they have the same panel or different panel, if you have to rehear it. It's quite varied advice. I think it depends on the case. If the IRP said the panel hadn't considered something and felt there was a problem with the way the panel was conducted or the committee was conducted, then you might end up having a new committee. If you wanted a bit of historical knowledge and a fresh view, you might have a mixture, 1 or 2 from the original committee and then maybe somebody new. It might be that the IRP found that there was some information that wasn't provided that should have been provided to the original committee. So maybe that, in that case, it would be worth having the original governors so that they can add on that new information to what they already know. So there's no hard and fast rule about this. It's the basic message. So your trust, and Alison and the governance professional involved would probably discuss and sometimes even get legal advice from your trust's lawyers on the best way to approach it. As I say, it's probably done on a case-by-case basis. And if you're on one of those sort of rehearing panels, you might come out with the same decision at the end. But what you should do is go through your IRP letter with addressing each point in turn and then show in your minutes and your decision letter how you've considered those. So that's it. It's open to questions now. Any further questions? Pete.
Just a quick question about information being sent out. I was chairing a panel at another trust, and the parents said they'd only received the information the Thursday before, which was about five and a half days before, and said they didn't have time to read the documents. Yeah, there were 184 pages, which is norm as it is. What would you advise with that then? Because we ended up having to suspend it and then do it again the week later to give them more time to read.
I think the guidance says you should receive it at least 5 days before.
Which they had, but they said they didn't have time to read it.
Well, they should have got into it. Should be on them really to say to the governance professional, haven't had time. That seems a bit unfair on everybody who's organised that committee meeting, for somebody to do that. That if you haven't got time, then you shouldn't have volunteered to do it in the first place, would be my view.
Yeah, no, it was a parent that said they didn't have time to read it, and so we were advised to suspend it for a few days and come back, which threw our diaries quite out of the window, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not fair on everybody else, really, is it? So if you can't make that
there's
time,
nowhere written down to say that, is there? How many days should you have it? I mean, I get frustrated if I don't get a week, because 180 odd pages is a lot to read.
Yeah, I'd aim to provide at least a week before, so 7 days before. But I think I'm just looking at the guidance. I'm sure it says that you should have it at least 5 days before. But I won't be able to find that and talk at the same time.
Oh, that's all right.
But 5 days is still. But I suppose another thing that perhaps on reflection that trust could consider: do they really need 180 pages of documentation? Is that overkill?
I think some schools or heads put as much information as possible because they don't want it to fail, but then they can be overload, and it's like that. It's like that painting a picture, isn't it? That they put everything and anything in it that might be even 2-3 years old, which is not relevant to why you're there. However, it paints a picture in their eyes that what the child's been doing within the academy, and although we don't take that into consideration, because it's, like I say, it could be based on a one-off incident that's happened, or it could be chronological, where it's something that's been happening since the beginning of the academic year to where you are now. So, and I don't think sometimes principals get that, so like, I think 180 odd pages. I think the shortest I've ever had is 64. But then there was nothing in the 64 either to say anything. So, yeah.
I would have said, if I was then going back to that principal to say, how could we improve this in the future, then maybe it was going back to Anna's question, really, that you would put in quite a bit of detail about what's happened recently, and perhaps this academic year. But if they've got a whole behaviour history, perhaps you just put in a summary of what's happened in previous years, so you're not detailing every single incident.
Yeah, which is what's been recommended in the past. But they still don't listen.
It's that, and I understand why principals, that I've taken this huge decision. I need to provide as much information as possible, but the panel or the committee meeting is a chance for people to ask for further detail if they want it.
I think as well, something similar-ish, Pete, to what you're saying, is if for some reason we haven't managed to get the paperwork out in time and we haven't had the 5 days, I think we need to, acknowledge that, really, and just make sure that the parents have had chance to read it at the meeting and acknowledge. Otherwise, we might fall foul of the, one of the tests as to whether we've been fair or not with that. So that's just something that we would make sure that we minute as well.
That's one of my things to people at the meeting, that you've got this documentation, has everybody had it long enough to read it, etc. One of my other things as well, especially if you've got the student in that meeting, is that please be aware this is not a personal attack on you. This is just information that's being shared to the panel or the committee, so that we have an understanding of what's actually happened, so we can have an informed decision, because we don't want them sitting there thinking, well, they're just picking on me, when we're not actually doing that. Forced under silence now.
Any more questions, anybody? I mean, I sincerely hope that we don't have to use any of Kathy's presentation, because we won't have any more fixed period or permanent exclusions. That would be the ideal, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And certainly we don't want to get to the stage of IRPs as well. So I do understand that principals do want to give as much information as possible so that, a fair review can be undertaken. Hopefully not get to that stage. A bit like Kathy, thankfully they're very rare. Let's hope that they stay that way. But for those of you that have been on panels for us, thanks ever so much. We're always really grateful. I know quite often you get begging emails from governance professionals saying, please, can anybody sit on a panel, etc., especially when two or three of them might be messaging at the same time trying to find these. But as Kathy said, we do have statutory timelines to try and adhere to, so sometimes that is necessary.
I do it so I don't get red flagged.
Okay, and any other questions for Kathy while we're on? Otherwise, we will bid you all a good evening, and thank you very much for your attendance.
I just want to say that was very useful, and are we getting a copy of the slides?
Yeah, Kathy, I can send those to you, Alison.
Yeah, okay, that's lovely. I'll put those in SharePoint along